welcome back everyone, or welcome for the first time to the Positive Investment Symposium. Just to start, I'll tell you a bit about what's happening in case people weren't here for the keynote. So Positive Investment Imperial is a group of students at Imperial College Business School aiming to educate and galvanise actors towards positive investment practices. And this symposium is a culmination of their work this year on research, education and endowment. And we're really excited to have you here with us today. I've been working with the organising committee on this event and it's been really brilliant. So I do encourage you to check out after this any of the sessions that you might have missed. And also, if you are a student watching this panel and you're interested in learning more about positive investment and the different chapters around the UK, or in starting your own group on your campus, then please do get in touch with Positive Investment Imperial, because we'd love to have more of them. So I'm Mel. I'm a campaign manager at an organisation called Students Organising for Sustainability UK, SOS UK, and that's a student-led education charity focusing on sustainability. I work specifically on a campaign called Invest for Change, which is a campaign calling on universities to reform their investment practices to centre environmental and social justice solutions. We've been working over the past year to ask UK universities to do three things: invest in impact investments, so investments that have a positive measurable impact on the ground as well as a financial return, for example things like renewable energy infrastructure, to engage with their investments, the investments that they do have, specifically in bigger companies, and to push for better practices, for example by voting at AGMs, which we heard Ellen speak about a bit in the keynote. And finally, to adopt comprehensive responsible investment policies that embed the above two things and also commit to things like regular reporting and disclosure, and staff and student engagement in governance on investments. Invest for Change is a national campaign working with students to engage their universities on responsible investment, and also working directly with universities to lead this shift. Just before we start and introduce you to our brilliant panelists, I just thought I'd go through some background of where we are and what we're going to talk about today. So apologies if people are very well versed in this and don't need this, but it'll only be a minute or two. Divestment is a term that's become widely used amongst a lot of students to signify universities divesting their endowment funds from fossil fuels. So currently 87 universities, which is now well over half of UK universities, have committed to this, thanks to really groundbreaking student campaigning over the past kind of 10 years, led by People and Planet student activist networks on different campuses across the country. Last year, we saw both Oxford and Cambridge universities, which are two of the biggest endowments in the UK, and Cambridge is actually the largest endowment in Europe. Both of those committed to divestment from fossil fuels, so you can see that there's been a real shift. And both these commitments also included more than just simply divesting from the fossil fuel industry. They also spoke about things like adopting a framework for investing at Oxford, which we've got one of our panelists who might be able to tell us more about that, and ramping up investments in renewable energy at Cambridge. So you can see there's kind of been a bit of a shift. So a lot of these commitments have opened up a wider conversation around responsible investment. For anyone that kind of isn't familiar with that term, responsible investment can be defined as an approach to investment that explicitly acknowledges the relevance to the investor of environmental, social and governance factors, and of the long-term health and stability of the market as a whole. So in other words, investment that creates long-term social, environmental and economic value, combining financial and non-financial value creation. Over the last year, many UK universities have taken steps to improve their investment practices and centre responsible investment. So some examples of this include commitments to invest a proportion of investment portfolios into impact investing. So King's College London have committed to invest 40% of their portfolio into socially responsible impact investments by 2025. Some universities have worked with external organisations to make impact social impact investments in the local community, like the University of Edinburgh, working with an organisation called Big Society Capital. And many universities have made commitments to invest more in renewable energy following divestment from fossil fuels. There's been some engagement with companies. It's often not publicised hugely, but some universities or colleges at universities like Trinity College at the University of Cambridge have been involved in filing resolutions at AGMs and have been also involved, universities have been also involved a bit more generally with kind of just engaging with their holdings. Having said all these examples, there's still a lot more to be done, and I'm sure we'll hear from our brilliant panelists on their thoughts about that. So today we're going to hear from three different people who are or have been involved in engagement between universities and students on changing university investment practices. They'll share their experiences of institutional divestment and engagement with university endowment funds. And we'll explore and share some best practices and strategies from both sides of the table, as well as looking at what comes next after divestment commitments and how we can keep our institutions accountable. So we'll get started. I'm going to actually pass over to each panelist to quickly introduce themselves, as I'm sure they'll do a better job than I can. And if you could also give us a really short overview of your experience with university endowments, that would be great. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Phil to start.
Okay, thanks, Mel. Right, my name's Phil McNaull. I was Finance Director at Edinburgh University from September 2012 to December 2018. During that time, we made a significant improvement in the university's approach to dealing with not just climate change, energy, but social responsible investment, and actually changing the whole way the university thought about all the capitals that are involved in running the organisation, all the resources you take from it. So I'd recommend that, here's the first plug, I recommend you read the annual report. It's a very good read, it's well designed, and it's got a lot of the points that we'll be talking about embedded throughout it. I was on a steering committee back in 2018, where I met Mel and Lily and Katie from Big Society Capital, and we put forward the idea of looked at a proposal to bring forward responsible investment for universities, which the University of Edinburgh signed up to, I think last year as a founding member. I think Dave Gorman, who's the social responsibility investor at Edinburgh, is now one of the leading proponents of this. So there's lots of best practice that people can look at from there. I'm very pleased to have been invited onto the steering group for Mel's Invest for Change campaign. And as somebody who bears the scars of student activism, about which possibly more later, it's very good to be there both as a proponent of this and as somebody who's had live action to talk about.
Great, thanks, Phil. So we'll pass over to Sam now.
Hi everyone, and thanks Mel for the introduction. So my name's Sam. I'm a PhD student at the University of Oxford. I study the Arctic Ocean, and alongside that, scientific interest in climate change. I've got a keen interest in our societal response and positive investments being kind of a way that that's manifested for me. So my experience with university endowments begins in my undergraduate. I was at Oxford as well for undergrad, and I worked on divestment campaigns then, but that shifted over time, and I got hooked into what Ellen was doing at Cambridge, for instance, who we heard from earlier, and a number of others such as Lily, who now works with Share Action and runs that network that Phil just mentioned. And we started thinking about other tools in the toolbox, basically, and hopefully this is something we'll come on to talk about in a bit, which is that, you know, there are multiple tools in the toolbox, and it's best to be oriented on a mission rather than simply wielding a certain tool. And so during my PhD, we've been trying to connect bursars and get them to move on this journey together, and working closely with some of them individually, as well as participating in that in the shaping of that motion that Mel mentioned earlier, which was the central university committing to divest from fossil fuels, but also to take on this mission of engaging along the lines of the so-called Oxford-Martin principles, which is something I might be able to explain a bit later. But for now, I'll pass back to Mel. Thanks.
Perfect, thanks, Sam. And so we'll go to our final panelist, Arthur.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm Arthur. I'm an undergrad student at LSE, and I'm the co-president of the Sustainable Future Society. And we've committed ourselves this year to improving sustainability at LSE overall. I've been working very closely with our sustainability team and key stakeholders. And in terms of divestment, we have kind of tried to make change from the inside this year because collective action and things like that were a bit difficult. So members of our team sit on various committees within LSE. I sit on the Sustainability Leadership Board with the LSE Director and the Director of Finance, which meets termly, and we try to bring concrete proposal to that committee in order to generate some change. We don't believe that change has happened fast enough. So we're trying to go a bit broader this over the summer and next year with our relaunch of our Climate Emergency Collective and our Divestment Alliance, where we'll try to involve professors and students to build an alliance around positive investment, as we believe LSE is lagging behind many other universities at the moment. And I'm happy to share my experience in doing that. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So we'll start off with quite like a broad question for a lot of people thinking about this at universities. The starting point is kind of divestment from fossil fuels. So if we can just kind of go around and the question is, what have been your strategies on engaging with or as a university on divestment, and what were your frameworks to guide your specific policies and commitments? I guess we'll start with Phil, if that's okay.
Okay. Yeah, I think you've had several definitions over today and yesterday about fossil fuel divestment, so I'll not give you another one. But the University of Edinburgh started with a social responsibility and sustainability strategy that was developed in 2010, a couple of years before I came. And the responsible investment policy statement was developed, updated in 2016. But we've been working all the way from the start. The intention was to try and make the organisation more aware of the impact it has, both the resources it draws, human capital, financial capital, natural capital, and so on, and then what it does with that and what impact it has. And really the idea was that when we, for example, published our financial statements each year, the annual accounts, it tended to be just focused on money. It was just about the standard format that all universities fell to as a default, which was the minimum number of boilerplate words, the minimum number of numbers in to comply. So it was all about compliance. I saw it as an opportunity to make a big statement about what the organisation was doing and the impact it was having. So in 2013, just shortly after I'd started, one of my team suggested there was an opportunity to sign up for something called the Principles for Responsible Investment. And we did that, and we were the first university in Europe to do that. And that created a significant impact. It echoes what Ellen was saying earlier, that it's not enough to just say divest or just vote against. Actually making it public, making a fuss of what you're doing is really important, because it leverages your efforts by a significant amount. I was just reading today on a piece that Dave Gorman and one of his colleagues at Northampton did, and the impact of Northampton's just over £1 million social investment. They scaled up to the equivalent of over £50 million had it tried to be impacted by, say, government finance or money from other resources. So creating that leverage is really important. And a big organisation like Edinburgh University, one of the top 30 in the world, when people say things, it matters, people listen. So on the investment committee, I tried to change our approach away from simply financial return, and to cut a very long story short, had a number of big fights with a number of the sort of lay members of the investment committee. And eventually, I think the thing that really got them was that, A, we were starting to get evidence that investing could give you a financial return as well as a positive impact return. And in fact, now there's a lot of evidence supporting that. At that time, there wasn't as much. But trying to say to people, but the purpose of the university is to make the world a better place. That's what we're here for. The teaching, research, all the activities we do should be doing that. So it is bizarre that all of those principles stop when you get onto the investment committee. Where does it say that you have only to make a financial return? And in fact, in the statement of investment, it said that we were there to make a financial return. So I managed to get that changed and persuade the university that the investment principles should include a statement that we were trying to do more than simply get a financial return. We had to make a positive impact on society. And really, once we get over that, the roller coaster just kept going. So we started divesting from fossil fuels, and we developed a review team, including students, and academics and professional services people, to look at that. And on the back of that, we then wrote to the fossil fuel members in our investment portfolio, asked them to divest within to make a statement about their intention to become greener in their approach within a month, or we would plan to divest. And we did that. And that was very interesting because that public statement had a much, much bigger impact than I thought. And I found myself about a month later talking to Chad Holliday, who was the new chairman of the Shell group at the time, Global Shell, who was in Edinburgh for an investors presentation. And he said, can we come along and have a chat? So he and about 5 of his entourage appeared, and we hosted them in Edinburgh University Old College and spent 45 minutes talking about why we thought they were potentially doing the wrong thing, but what they could do better. And he accepted a lot of it. He said, I've got an enormous organization to turn around, but it's not going to happen overnight. But I think even his enthusiasm has proved that it's not moving perhaps quite as fast as everybody would like. As a consequence, we divested from them and others. So there's been a number of strategies that we developed through the investment committee, but also through influencing the rest of the organization. So the estates director, how aware of energy consumption, impact on society, becoming a responsible organization within the community. These are other things that we can get involved in. So divestment and fossil fuels sounded like one good one. Actually, from a whole organization point of view, there is an enormous amount more can be done. Will that do for starters, Mel? I could talk for days on this, sorry.
No, that's brilliant. That's brilliant. Thank you, Phil. It's great to kind of get that overview from you. Sam, do you want to go and kind of give us an overview of like the strategies you've used in engaging with the university on these things?
Sure, yeah, so I guess there are kind of layers to this question, but maybe we should start on that outer layer, which is what are the strategies we've used to kind of get their attention and try and get them on board with us. And then there's the sort of inner layer of what strategies do we want them to be taking themselves in their like endowment approach. Yeah, as I mentioned, I got involved in all of this stuff when I was an undergrad, and I really got involved with the activism side of things. So we made a big big fuss about the fact that the university had these financial ties with the fossil fuel industry, and I think that was for one thing, it was great fun, but it was also a really good way of movement building and drawing attention to this issue. So I think it was great, and while we might say that divestment is limited in some of its scope, especially if it's done quietly, so that's something we have to talk about really. It's been something that everyone could kind of gather together around, and it was part of a movement building process. So that was very important. So that was one way that we got attention, one strategy, if you like. But ultimately, it didn't get us anywhere at the time, at least. In 2015, I think it was, the university essentially refused all of our requests. And so we were sort of back to square one, having got lots of pictures in the papers and things like that. We made a 15-foot dinosaur at one point that was representing big oil. So, we had a lot of fun and built movement, but it didn't amount to much in terms of tangible action on the university side. So I guess sort of frustrated by that experience. I wanted to think about different approaches, myself and a number of others at Oxford and Cambridge. And this is why we got into positive investment. And our strategy in terms of engaging with the university and the colleges has been different. It's been more, it's been less adversarial, you might say, and less public, less activisty. It's been more cooperative and trying to work with them to identify things that they can do. And I think that we've had quite a bit of success with that. With the way it works in Oxford, there are a number of colleges that manage their own investment portfolios, and the others is roughly half and half. So the other half give their money to the central endowment manager, Oxford University endowment manager, to be managed, and that obviously manages the central university's money too. So the way that we work obviously depends on the situation. There's these individual college endowments, and then there's the university. So that we have different approaches for each. And on the college burses side, there are obviously fewer people involved, and you have a slightly more direct route. So your strategy is more to do with meeting the individuals in question and trying to persuade them that they ought to be making certain changes, or and I think it's important to come back to this idea of the changes being mission oriented, you know, and I think the important, well, the way we've been thinking about it is, firstly, you identify your mission, and our mission at Positive Investment is to make finance work for a more sustainable, more just future, fairer future. And then you think about the tools in your toolbox, and you think about the landscape that you're in and what tools that you can use, and what are the levers available for you to pull. So with college endowments, for instance, they're not vast amounts of money, but they are valued clients of asset managers, and we kind of see the asset managers as being the bigger lever there, really. So it's about, in that setting, it's about trying to get the colleges to really hold their asset managers to a higher standard. You know, the colleges don't have huge resources to do their own you know, extensive shareholder activism or doing lots of their own individual impact investment, but they do have these asset managers, and they can be holding them to a higher standard, and hopefully in that way having a ripple effect on the rest of the financial system. So we would go down more of that kind of strategy with the colleges. And yeah, with the central university, it's been more difficult to have sort of personal interaction with the decision makers. So our strategy has been sort of mixed depending on the setting, but we've used more sort of motions in that sense, and formal routes for getting things done, as well as informal meetings in pubs, for instance, to talk to people and work out what, you know, to make sure you know who are the decision makers, and try and understand what their concerns are, and how you can mitigate those, or where the gaps in their understanding are, because often it's the case that you have people that are at a sort of advanced stage in their careers, but this is quite a new thing in some ways, and so there is actually an education gap on the part of the endowment managers often, so you have to try and meet that where possible. So one of our strategies has been to plug that gap by organising bursar events, where we get the bursars together and we have some talks and give them a forum in which to discuss sustainable investing, and feel like that it's something they can be involved in, and there's no stigma of sort of striking out on their own, because that's one of the things they're worried about, is striking out on their own and looking stupid for doing so. So it's important to try and build some kind of community in making that progress. Okay, I think that's all I want to say for now. Thanks.
No, that's brilliant. I think there's some really great points in there. I think that idea of kind of, having a really cooperative approach and doing the education as well is really important, as well as noticing that sometimes something I've been speaking to students a lot over the past year is that, universities this year have been lacking in a lot of resource due to COVID, but investment is an area where they do have a third party managing it, and so it can be something that doesn't take up as much. It's not as big an ask resource wise potentially. Great. So Arthur, we'll pass on to you. So what of the strategies I know you're kind of currently in your engaging with the university time. So what kind of strategies have you guys been employing?
I think it's very interesting because my experience has been exactly the opposite way around than Sam's, because we've started off with engaging closely with the institution, because we're lucky to have seats on some of the committees as part of our roles. And we've been working very closely with our SU Environment and Ethics Officer, who also sits on the investment subcommittee. So we've tried to bring forth concrete proposals there, such as conducting a TPI analysis on LSE's current holdings, which actually has been achieved. So we're very happy about that. And we know the results now. It took some time, but yeah, so we know how our endowment, at least a proportion of our endowment, performs in terms of the TPI evaluation now. And the other thing that we achieved this way is we achieved the publishing of some of the holdings online, which wasn't the case before. So as you can see, LSE in many areas is still very, very, very much behind other universities, and we're still trying to get the first steps kind of going transparency so that students actually have the information. The second problem is that many of these meetings, they have terms and references, so we're not allowed to share the details with the students. So getting some of the holdings up online was actually a huge success, and now we can show students the actual data and create some sort of movement around that. It's still been difficult, and we think we can do much more. And the question is, Sam, whether you would have been this successful in your institutional engagement if you hadn't had the kind of public movement before, because it's about making stakeholders realize that there is public support behind this, and then you can talk. So maybe your approach is actually more efficient than mine than ours, but that's just because I started getting into this during this year where any kind of public action was not very possible. So yeah, we're trying now to go more public, and we're working on a pledge to have some of the concrete demands. And that's another advantage we have, because we've been in these meetings for so long. We know exactly what we want to change, and we can put very specific demands on our pledge and send that out to students and professors and academics to sign. And the second part is we're trying to start somewhat of a public protest type, like your dinosaur story. So the plan is for the Green Week next year to maybe paint our Students' Union building with some of the statistics that were published about LSE's investments. So we hope we can make more progress there and actually get down to the actionable points, because so far information has been released, analysis has been conducted, but no action has been taken as a result of that. And we're worried that if we continue going down this path and we graduate, and they know we're graduating, right? So that might just fade away and water down. So we think it's actually necessary to have this kind of public movement, just from our own experience, because commitments that I guess hurt need some kind of incentive. And just sitting in meetings with me and me being very annoying there, I don't think that's enough for change.
Great. I'm actually just going to, before we go on to our next question, I'm just going to give Phil a chance to speak, because I know to give kind of that other side of the importance and difference between kind of making a lot of noise in the kind of student activist space and then engaging directly with the university. I know Phil was involved in both of those at Edinburgh. So I just thought I'd pass to you for a second to see if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think there's some good points that Sam and Arthur made there. I just wondered, Sam, if you've tried, because you've got multiple colleges all with little endowments, have they tried putting them all together? And one way of trying to make the point is look at maybe a 10 to 15-year trend of the endowment performance of each college against the overall college and against, say, Cambridge and Edinburgh. Our investment committee chair announced proudly each year that the Edinburgh University Endowment had beaten Oxford and Cambridge again. This was one of his objectives. It was a little bit of fun. But I think if you've got if you've got colleges with a lot of pride in their own return, demonstrate from the financial performance first that it might be better to aggregate the funds and get bigger impact. And then on the back of that, you can look at the principles of investment. So we're not going to invest in armaments or alcohol. We are going to try and invest in positive stuff. And it's a bit of both. So you try and get a bit of rational in there. I think the question that Mel was asking, we had a couple of examples. We had a very, very active group from People and Planet. There was an Edinburgh University student was in the leadership group there. She wasn't really interested in dialogue. I famously remember going in when they'd occupied the admin building in Chambers Street and we couldn't get into our offices, going in to have a chat and a dialogue. And I was with the university deputy secretary, and we started to talk, and her response was da 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 da. And I didn't think that was a particularly helpful way to have a debate about what we're trying to do. And really, she was only interested in a big noise. And really, the bulk of the work that was needing to be done to identify what the university was going to do had already been done by the time that student protest started. And the reason we took it on was because the president and the vice president at the time, I think it was 2013 or 14, were actually really keen on, students get voted in to Students' Association on certain agenda priorities. And theirs was on climate change. So we said, okay, let's have a look at it. Let's see what we can do. We want to do it. And I was keen on doing it anyway. So we set up a group chaired by the senior vice principal, and it had 2 student members, the FD, some academics, and some professional services people. And we were very, very productive. I mean, the vice principal ran it in a very efficient manner, delegated loads of work. It was all going to be evidence-based. We were going to open up principles. And everybody, without exception, who joined that group changed their view slightly or a lot based on the evidence that we collected and analysed. And on the back of that, we were ready to have the debate with the investment committee at the time the protest started. So the protest definitely created some airtime, but the strategy of the university was give them as much time as they want. Don't try and force them out, and just let them make noise. And eventually, the protest and the occupation went from a big event with my office was occupied, and they placed one of the security team outside, and I went down to see him, and he was sitting in a chair like this. They shall not pass. And what he didn't realise was that there was a ladder up against the window outside, and all the people inside were being refreshed with curries and beer and all the rest of it through this window, while he stood guard and made sure nobody could come in and spot it was happening. So there was a lot of fun, as well as some serious point. It was really disruptive. One of the bad things from the students' point of view was it put people's backs up, and they gradually lost a lot of support. And it's interesting when you compare the impact of the 2 students on the review committee versus the 30 students who occupied the building, who got virtually no social media support for what they were doing. Very, very much more effective by that dialogue, having good discussion. And the great thing that Mel and her team have done on this campaign is they've gathered evidence, and there's 2 guides, one for students, one for universities. And these are good handbooks as to how do you get things done? What's the best way to do it? How do I tackle things when we're new? Arthur made that great point about, well, we're new, and when we graduate, we're gone. Just make sure that you recruit early. Have a table at the open day when the students first come in the first week, and recruit people, and make sure you've got a rolling program of people who take up the cudgels and do the right thing. And that way you retain the corporate memory of what you've been trying to do.
Great, and I'm sure that there were benefits for having that occupation that they might have not had without it, kind of that noise that we were talking about earlier. But you can see there kind of the difference in those strategies and what they get you at the end. One question I wanted to ask is kind of moving on from that divestment point. So a lot of universities have committed to divestment. Edinburgh have actually announced fully divesting from the fossil fuel industry, and a couple are following suit at getting to that actual point. So for you, what's next for universities after this? What's the next thing to be talking about, to be doing? I guess, can we start with Sam on that one?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, just to pick up on your point quickly, Phil. So as I said, about half of the colleges are have their funds managed centrally, and the other half do it themselves. And I can't really see them grouping together their funds, but they what they could do, which I think would be great, is a bit more collaborative shareholder engagement to work together as by combining their voices. I think that would be a great thing to happen. But to this question about divestment, what's next after divestment? I think it's a great question, very exciting topic, because there's a lot to do. And yeah, it really, you can kind of see a new chapter from divestment onwards. So if we think, what's the mission behind the divestment campaign, or what should it have been at least? It was to basically to bring fossil fuel consumption down, and the way it did that was to stigmatize the oil and gas industry, and coal, of course, to encourage, as Ellen discussed earlier, country level legislation. So it's taking away their social license to operate to encourage that legislation. In terms of the financial impact, it's actually quite limited. So that's something we can bear in mind to begin with. But we can take that mission and we can think about other tools in the positive investment toolbox to try and tackle that mission. So the way that I like to think about it is to divide it into three chunks. You've got consumption, production, and transformation. So this is my sort of way of thinking about getting to net zero in terms of reducing fossil fuels, our use of fossil fuels. So on the production side, this is where we need to be thinking about cutting the cycle of capital that that enables production to occur. As Ellen described earlier, most of this is through debt issuance. And so actually those trades on the public equity market, they don't really matter that much. The effect of divestment is primarily through the stigmatization of the companies. So most of it's in debt, and most of that is from bank loans, and the other part is from bonds, so debt issuances by the companies. So we need to think about how we can cut that cycle of capital to fossil fuel producers. So that's clearly by sorting out the lending policies of banks, firstly, and also by extending divestment commitments into the debt portfolios of institutions like universities. Many of them already have these divestment commitments. It shouldn't be too big of an ask to try and get them to extend that into their bond portfolios. I don't know the exact ins and outs of exactly how that works. There might be some barriers, but that's kind of what we should be aiming at, I think. And that's really where that has a more direct financial impact as well, as Ellen described earlier. So I think that's the production element mostly. The bank loans bit is interesting. I guess that colleges, for instance, or universities use retail banks. So they've got a direct ear, I guess, of a retail bank that they can kind of pull and say, you need to sort out your lending policies in line with the Paris Agreement, essentially. And all banks probably aren't doing a great job of that. And this is something we've worked on at Positive Investment. We had a bank switch campaign that was aimed at students, but obviously there's an institutional side to this as well. So we would obviously be encouraging students to get involved in terms of switching their banks or encouraging banks to change their learning policies, as well as the colleges and universities. Okay, so that's the production side. Consumption is next, and I think unless demand for fossil fuels shrinks, our sort of punitive measures on the production side are unlikely to succeed. So we have to think about the whole economy demanding fossil fuels and how how we as educational endowments interact with that whole economy and how we can help to curb that demand. That's really important. And the case study I want to bring in here is the Oxford Martin principle. So this is what this is research that's been developed at Oxford, of course, and it's something that's been adopted by the university's endowment manager as a way to engage with their asset managers and their underlying companies. And it's got 3 components. Sorry, I feel like I'm doing a lot of lists of 3, but bear with me. So the Oxford Martin principles have 3 components for engagement towards a net zero future, right? So the first component is that companies must have a commitment to net zero. That's fundamental. The second is that they will have a profitable net zero business model, because you're investing in them, you want them to be profitable in a net zero future. And then thirdly, that they must have quantitative midterm targets, because it's all very well having a very distant 2050 target, but you need to demonstrate that you're making progress towards that and have shorter term targets to meet towards meeting that. So I think, yeah, that's one great example of how you tackle the consumption side of this. And then the third one is transformation. And I think that we should be thinking about impact investing when we're talking about transformation, alongside, of course, engagement in public equity. So as Ellen described earlier, impact investing is something that has a different definition depending on the asset class. So universities typically have lots of different asset classes in their portfolios. And I personally think that it's hard to describe asset allocation on the secondary market, i.e. in public equity, as impactful. Rather, the impact comes from asset allocation on the primary market. So that's where when you invest in a company, you're giving them money. So this is like private equity and debt issuances and venture capital and stuff like that. So obviously, by choosing who they invest in, they can have a material impact on, they can have what's called additionality in terms of promoting those businesses. So yeah, impact investing on the primary market is a sort of central thing that we're pushing universities to do in terms of galvanizing the transformation towards a just transition. Yeah, sorry, just to summarize those 3 things of production, consumption and transformation, and they all have slightly different facets, and hopefully that made sense, but apologies if I went quite quickly over them or used too many lists, but maybe we can come back as and when.
No, brilliant. It was very clear. I think the lists were good. Phil or Arthur, do you have any thoughts on kind of anything Sam said, or kind of what's next for universities after these divestment commitments in terms of their endowments?
Yes, I think if I can go first, Arthur, I think the couple of good points made by Sam there. What next? I was saying that universities need to think about this holistically, and for example, reducing consumption is a really good way of doing it. Taking on the oil majors head on is one thing, but the majority of oil is extracted and sold by state-owned organizations, not commercial, publicly listed companies. So no matter what you do on the production side, you're missing a very big bit. Much better to hit them in a competitive way where it hurts. So what can you do that competes with oil? And renewable energy is a good way of doing it. So in Edinburgh University, we installed a solar farm with about 5,000 ground-mounted panels, which is just probably going to save something like £200,000 a year. In electricity consumption over the last, I think it's 7 or 8 years, they've saved almost 1 gigawatt of electricity coming from the grid, and it's now been generated by solar. So there are things that each organization can do, and the more that's done and the more that's made of that, the more it's starting to accelerate. When I started on this journey about maybe 8 years ago, I think it was now, the sense that you could invest in renewable energy was poo-pooed by a lot of people. It's too expensive. It's too difficult. It's too, edgy. And now it's absolutely bog standard, mainstream, massive reduction in costs, huge economies of scale. And that's now happening in multiple different areas. So there has been a tipping point where enough people start doing enough thing, consumption changes. Other things universities can do, flight policy. And let's build on the crisis of the pandemic where people were forced to work from home. So the number of conferences attended, the number of spurious trips to this, that, and the next event, all gone. People were forced to work by Zoom, and the transformation has been enormous. And it demonstrated, so you've got live case study material, that it can be done. Edinburgh University has now gone from, one of my very senior research colleagues at the time said, if I have to fly to London to do this, I'll do it. It's just ridiculous. You can't stop me doing that. To now, he's promoting the policy that says there will be no UK flights. There is a presumption you will not fly within the UK. You'll go by train or some other means, but you're not going to fly. And that's, wow. Once all the lockdown changes, it'll be interesting to see how well that sustains. But it's these individual type of activities are great ways of making an incremental change in each of the three areas that Sam talked about. The impact investment, we put 60 million of positive investment in through venture capital and other types of funds, through Mercer renewable funds. So we moved from negative screening to positive impact investing. And it's amazing, it takes a long time. It was hard work to get it done. But once you're persuaded and you've been persistent, all of a sudden everybody thinks, oh, well, this is easy. We'll just do this, not realizing just how much effort it took to get there. So I would definitely encourage people to keep pushing at all of these different areas.
Brilliant. Thanks, Phil. Arthur, do you have any thoughts on kind of your experience of what else you're asking the university for other than divestment from fossil fuels?
Yeah, I think it's because we're still working on the negative filters at the moment. We're still trying to get negative filters implemented. We haven't even started to think about kind of impact investing, even though that's going to be in our pledge as well. So that's the main focus at the moment, is to try to get fossil fuel divestment and divestment from uncontroversial armaments done. But beyond that, I think what many universities have done, and it's good to see, is publish some kind of comprehensive reports about how they're going to make their whole university greener over the long term. And I think they are very useful. Some of them are a bit too general, but overall it's a very good improvement, because it's how do we become greener as a whole university, and then each kind of division plays its part in that, and there are monitoring mechanisms and stuff like that. So that's great to see at LSE as well. I think one of the biggest impacts universities can have is obviously on their students. And I think LSE has a particular issue with that, because the student population is somewhat divided, with one part being very politically active, and I guess around 40% not being active at all, and not kind of getting a taste of this culture of change and making the world a better place. I don't think it's an easy thing to do, to get people into the movement and not rely on the same people all the time. But we have tried to work on some ways to get this done, and I think our experiences have been quite interesting. So for LSE particularly, there's a lot of people interested in finance stuff or consulting stuff, for example. And as a society, we've launched a Sustainable Investment Club, where we try to collect real money from sponsors and invest that in impact investing as an experience for students to learn, and also to kind of drag them into the environmental movement. And that way, we also try to do careers event with different startups. So a different kind of demographic attends. And when they go out in the world afterwards, and they work wherever, they'll have these things in mind, and they have at least an awareness of sustainability and what it means to have an impact. The other thing we're trying to do, and that's another initiative of ours, is embed sustainability into the courses of the departments where it isn't as present. So outside the geography and environment department, basically all the departments, other than that one. And we're trying to recruit students from each department to write reports and analyze their courses and suggest places where sustainability could be implemented. And additionally, we're trying to get some kind of induction module where sustainability is introduced to all students, and the activities of how to get engaged and involved are outlined. Yeah.
Can I just pick up one point there, Arthur, you made? You said that a lot of people don't get it. I mean, the LSE must have quite an impressive list of alumni, and there must be a few of those who you can target relatively easy, particularly those who've given any indication that they're at all sympathetic to this line. Maybe you can go to your alumni development team and say, you know, give us a list of who's interested in this, and we'll meet up with them, and you can get a pincer movement, because the LSE's been known for a couple of high-profile events where a bit of publicity didn't go quite the way they wanted it, and there was a very rapid change of footwork to get them back on site. You can do that again. I mean, this is a great opportunity to do it.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a great point. So for our divestment campaign, and we might change the naming a little bit to make it more attractive to certain kind of alumni, maybe call it positive investment or something like that.
Yeah.
For that pledge, we're trying to get as many alumni on board as possible, and maybe host an event even with them voicing their concerns about LSE's current investment policy, or just talking about why divesting from fossil fuels is so important. Yeah, I think you're very right. Like, the alumni community that LSE has is one of the most important levers that we have. And
they're big in finance, a lot of them.
Yes.
We did a similar thing. Sorry to jump in, Mel. We did a similar thing when I was involved in the divestment campaign a while ago, and we organised a degree hand-back ceremony where we got several high-profile alumni to sort of metaphorically hand back their degrees to the university based on the fact that they were lagging behind on this, which, I don't know, I think that was quite fun, and it got a lot of attention. So, you know, that's the more activist side of doing things, but obviously you could engage your alumni in this more collaborative approach too. But Arthur, you mentioned earlier about having this sort of spectrum of approaches, and I think it's very important. And I think, you know, we've benefited at Oxford that there are a number of groups actually in this space, and I want to sort of give praise where it's due to, for instance, the climate justice campaign in Oxford that have been doing great work, movement building on this. Now, I was part of their team about 4 years ago before as well. And also they've done great work on making sure that the justice remains in the climate conversation, because it's absolutely an issue of social justice too. So I think it's difficult if you have to do it all by yourself, if you have to do the activist and the behind closed doors kind of stuff by yourself. That would be tricky, I imagine. It's great if you have multiple groups that can kind of span that spectrum, because I do think that is an important. It definitely helps to drive change forward.
And one very minor point that it picked up earlier on about saying to people, and you saying to particularly university executive committees or governance groups, and you make a point, and somebody says, yeah, that's a really important point, we'll definitely take that into consideration, blah blah blah. It's a really simple thing. You just say, well, if that's your adjective driven response, could we just have a SMART objective in that? So, you know what a SMART objective is: specific, measurable, agreed, realistic, timed. So you've got to name somebody who's going to do it. You've got to have a target date, and you've got to say what they're going to do. And it's actually, it's really funny, when you just ask a very simple, direct question, it's more difficult to fluff and flam. You just can't do it. So will you set a SMART target to achieve divestment from fossil fuels? Well, we're going to look at, no, that's not the question to ask. are you going to set a smart target? Because if you're not, just say it now, because I don't want to hear any more adjectives. I want to hear commitment. And that's the point where it becomes quite interesting.
I really like that, Phil. Thanks for that acronym. I've written it down. But I think that's great. And it's also something that we need to involve in a conversation between the asset owners, i.e. the universities, their bursars and their managers, because my belief is that the asset managers are the bigger lever really in the financial system here. And although the universities have a huge amount of sort of intellectual and social clout in terms of the financial system, it's really the asset managers that we need to galvanize. And we need to make climate justice, climate change, and the just transition part of every conversation they have with their asset managers. And these smart objectives need to be part of that, because the universities deserve higher standards from their asset managers on engagement and voting with their underlying companies. And
there are actually quite a lot of asset managers now. When I was looking at it, there was less than half a dozen, less than a handful you could look at. There's loads now who're starting to do it. Unfortunately, a lot of them are superficially driven by what they do. But I'm sure if you were to get in touch with Share Action, they would give you an indication of the investment managers that you could rely on to do the right thing. And if nothing else, they'll give you the right questions to ask of their competitors.
Exactly. There's in fact 2 reports that we can point you to there. They've got a review of global asset managers that Share Action do, which basically outlines their performance and engagement and voting. And then secondly, they've got those questions that Phil alluded to. There's a report for the Charities Responsible Investment Network. It's called Improving the Conversation with Asset Managers, as what can asset owners expect of their asset managers? And these are very simple questions, but they need to be viewed through this smart objectives lens. I think I like that a lot. So.
For us, oftentimes the fund managers, as they're called at LSE, they've been used as a kind of a scapegoat for lack of progress. And we've tried to update the evaluation process that LSE has for those fund managers, and we were successful in that, so that we have a better evaluation process now. But we don't know how to track whether these suggestions have been acted upon. Because we get, for these meetings, we get a stack of documents and we see the emails and the kind of recommendations that have been sent to the fund managers. And we cannot track whether there have been changes. And we were not sure what to do after these emails have been sent and there have been no changes. So it's that kind of structure is actually a big challenge. And just on your previous point about smart targets, I think another very useful strategy is, just for anybody interested, is make sure that what's being said is put down in the minutes. So in the next meeting, you can refer back and show the minutes and say, okay, this has been agreed to do. So what's happening?
Good.
Yeah, definitely. I think also that I often speak to student groups and students working on this, and it's about taking those minutes and sending them round after. So you're kind of sharing that you've taken them as well. We've got some time for questions from the audience. So if anyone has any questions for our 3 panelists, please do pop them in the Q&A on the bottom of your screens. In the meantime, just while we're waiting for any of those to come through, I suppose I just wanted to ask kind of what we've spoken a little bit about asset managers. And so for anyone that kind of isn't as plugged into how universities and their endowments work, just kind of an overview from your experience of how active universities are in kind of managing and monitoring their investments, and what we can do as students or as university, as parts of the university community, to kind of push for change within whatever that context is.
Yeah, I mean, I think from the investment committee, we had about 3 or 4, 5 meetings a year, and the university didn't actively manage its own money. All the money was put out to managers. So Baillie Gifford looked after the investment portfolio, Hermes would look after property portfolio, and we would have a beauty parade each meeting of a rolling program of asset managers coming in and presenting what they were doing with the fund. And I would look at the performance and I would make any decisions, because it was all about long-term investment. There was nothing snap decision required. The two students that I mentioned earlier who were really keen about fossil fuel divestment wanted to come along to the committee, and we invited them along. We split the agenda, so we had the topics they wanted to talk about, and then there was a whole bunch of other stuff that we had to do, and that was probably best kept confidential, not least because some of our asset managers wanted it kept confidential. But we were very open and said, right, come along. What do you want to talk about? What do you want to hear? And for quite a few meetings, we had them coming along and briefing them about what was happening, and they were briefing us about what the issues were. When those two students left, that died down, and there's not really been any desire, as far as I'm aware, at Edinburgh in recent years for that to happen. And that's probably because we did what we said we were going to do. We divested, we invested, we allocated 8 million for social investment, we put 60 million into positive investment. So there's nothing really for them to complain about. I am keen that they keep involved and they see what's happening and they spread the word. But there will be other universities that are nowhere near that level of maturity. And in those cases, I would simply, as the Students' Association, ask your colleagues, the registrar or whoever, and say, could we have a 20-minute slot at the beginning of the next investment committee meeting to talk about the issues that are important to us and hear what your responses are? I think it'd be very unusual if somebody flat out refused that type of approach.
Yeah, I've been involved in that kind of thing. In one of the colleges, I've been sort of regular attendee at the investment committee meetings, and I've also been involved with the meetings with the asset managers, just with the bursars, for instance. So that's been a kind of great insight into how that all works. And they meet fairly regularly, and so I think it's, if students can get involved in those meetings in a way that's not just ad hoc, because in our case it was kind of on the basis of trust. It was the first time that it had happened, and it was sort of ad hoc. We pushed for it to be baked into the system, but we did get a bit of pushback because they wanted, they felt like they had no assurance that that position wouldn't be exploited or misused, I guess, is that how they felt anyway. And
that's a good point, Sam, because that's a really important point, and it's where I said this to Mel before I came on the steering group. I'm in favour of active change through negotiation and reasoned argument, and blocking buildings and stopping people getting in for a week to do their work. I just don't agree with that. I think that's wrong. But I think you can make a big impact through reasoned debate, and therefore I would push for that. And you can always have the hint of, well, if you don't do that, we'll blockade the building. If you want to do that, much better to sort of say, look, give us 15 minutes and we'll persuade you. We'll change your mind.
Yeah, I was always surprised, to be honest, how climate change really didn't feature in those meetings, and how it was incumbent on us as the students in the room to bring it up. And this was surprising to me because colleges are long-term thinkers in terms of investing, and I just thought, by 2035 our economy is going to be, well, now it's going to be 78%, I think, CO2 was in 1990 levels, I think, a huge reduction. And that means a transformational change for the economy. And it's not really that far away in terms of the time horizons that universities and colleges think about. I mean, in another part of that meeting, they were talking about, property investments that would only really reap rewards decades down the line. So it was surprising to me that it wasn't more a natural part of the conversation, that there was this transformational change going on in the economy that ought to be thought about.
The stranded assets argument, so that a lot of the value of oil companies in the present value of the future discounted cash flows of that business, as you value all businesses. If you can't get that stuff out of the ground and sell it, then it's worthless. And a lot of the valuation in fossil fuel companies is in those assets, reserves, untapped to be used. Actually, the value of those is beginning to look riskier and riskier. And that's something that if you simply ask that question, so dear investment committee director, could you tell us what you're invested in, and if it's BP and Shell and all the rest of it, what's your view on the valuation of their stranded assets? And force them to talk about it, to give you an opinion. That opinion may be right or wrong, but it brings it up to the level of let's have an articulate debate about it rather than just saying I'm not going to do it.
The stranded assets is a great place to start. I would argue it's not. Phil, I'm sure you're not suggesting it's the end point at all, of course. Yeah. But having just watched Ellen's talk, for instance, I think we need to be using the language of universal ownership, and that's really what colleges and universities are. They're universal owners, and their investment success is tied in with the performance of the real economy, and they won't be able to diversify their way or stock pick their way out of climate risk or other systemic risks.
You might still need a new fossil fuel type company in the future, because if you look around you, we're not just talking about diesel and gas and jet fuel. Look at everything that's made of plastic, and all of us, without exception, will find something in front of you almost within hand's distance. What are you going to
wearing it even?
Exactly. What are you going to replace that with?
I'm just going to cut in, sorry, because we've got a couple of questions from the audience and we've only got 5 minutes left. So we've got a question from Marius, I hope I pronounced that right, saying thanks for the great discussion so far. Do any of you have any advice for student groups or universities in Europe or internationally?
I think from my experience, I actually went to a presentation in Berlin to try and talk to universities about raising funds. And what struck me very quickly was how irrelevant it was, because most of the universities were state funded and state owned. And the universities didn't have huge discretion for what they were going to do. Now, whether that extends to endowments and funds, I don't really know. But I think the general issue is that if you're a student and you have views, it is right to go and talk to your university about it, and they should listen. There have been some egregious examples of where that didn't work in Amsterdam when the governance body just did completely the wrong thing and they ended up with a riot outside. You don't want to get that far. So I think for international students, it's the same principle. Go and talk to the executive group, the governing group, use all your contacts. Don't just go one route, go multiple routes.
I think it's very much about setting up regular systems. So things that happened every month or every term, so your university can be held accountable. I think you made a great point, Phil, about sitting in on those meetings. I think it's actually important to sit in on every meeting and have a student representative there for every meeting. And that's the case at LSE, and that has worked well, even though we're still struggling to talk about sustainability because there are so many other things to talk about. So right now our goal is to set up a working group in terms of the divestment investments that just focuses on sustainable investment. So we have this topic talked about once a month or once in 2 months at length, and not just for 10 minutes in the investment subcommittee meeting. I think that's very important. In general terms, I think protests and civil disobedience, they can be fun and good, and I think we're planning to do at least something similar to that at LSE. But I think the other thing that's very important is to give students something to do and to have a feeling of achievement. So what we're trying to do in our society is to set up projects, small teams of students that dedicate themselves to one specific subject at the university. For example, plastic waste, food waste, education, the Freshers' Fair, or investments, and then they work on that topic for a year, and they have a result at the end. They publish a report. For example, our food and plastic waste projects, they each published 40 pages worth of suggestions for LSE to improve their food and plastic waste, and then bring that to your institutions into those meetings and have concrete kind of proposals for change. And also it gives students the opportunity to put stuff on their CV, because you don't want they need to get something in return too, you know. I think it's very good, especially for a university like LSE, to offer these kind of opportunities and to give some positions like project lead, communications manager, and stuff like that, and they can put that on their CV and they can write down their achievements, and it helps the university a lot, and it improves a lot of things, and it's a much more productive way of change making, I think.
Great. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our panel, and I'm really sorry to the people that have asked a couple of other questions that we didn't get time to go through them. But I'd just like to say a big thank you to our 3 brilliant panelists and to everyone for coming along. Hopefully we'll put some links in the chat now, which will tell you a bit more about some of the work Invest for Change are doing and some of the guides Phil spoke about earlier. And yeah, good luck in everyone's kind of work engaging with universities on this, and please do get in touch if you want any support. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank
Best
you.
of luck, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Everyone.
Bye.
Bye.